Hello everyone, my name is Robert Rollings. I'm a senior consultant at Deloitte and I specialise in people and workforce analytics, the latest fad in HR. I'm here today to talk about how you practically build the capability and the infrastructure that empowers business-facing HR to make evidence-based decisions. So that's me. I'm not quite sure how I move slides along, but oh.
So I use my own. There's another one here.
Oh, fab. Thank you. So I've been working in this area for about 5 years now, and I would absolutely agree with what Rob said about analytics, except that I would say that actually analytics is its own thing, but it's a combination of things. It's a combination of having the data, the business insight, and the technology to enable those evidence-based decisions that Rob talked about. And that's what I'm here to talk about, how you do that in practice. So I'm going to talk about how you embed analytics or evidence as a foundation of making management decisions, how you can demonstrate the return on investment of HR, so how HR can go to the boards of companies with evidence-based recommendations that they can then measure and understand how effective HR has been in being a key pillar of making business decisions, and then how you work out what might be going to happen in the future to start thinking about, well, if we do this, then what might happen? Therefore, what might be the best course of action to take? So, very busy slide, but there are a few key drivers that are making the analytics fad interesting at the moment. So, companies are searching for new ways to achieve profitable growth, but haven't they always? Regulators are demanding more and more from the industries which are regulated, more information about their people. The industry that I specialise in is oil and gas, and there is a great focus on understanding what capabilities people have, where they're deployed, and what the decisions are around why you deploy people into certain roles to meet the needs of regulators. Business is getting complicated, organisations are difficult to manage, especially when you're dealing with different cultures, different workforces, different business divisions, working in parallel or together across multiple geographies. How do you manage that complexity? How do you get the information you need to see the signal through the noise? There's just more data, there's loads of it. There's terabytes and terabytes of data that we have. And the important thing is, before that was just not accessible. We couldn't get the value out of it because we didn't have the machines, the mechanics, the technology to crunch it, to do stuff with it that would be useful. So now we're in a situation where we've got HR has to come up to the table with evidence to recommend to businesses to make decisions based on information. We've got the information, the source of the information is there, and we're starting to get the ability to process that information into insight, which can be then used to inform decision makers. So on your tables in front of you, there's a fold of paper. Sorry, paper over. And just on there is just a very simple matrix. And on there, I'd like you to just write your initials, where you think you are in terms of your understanding of what analytics is, from I have no understanding at all, to I am an expert in this area, and what your appetite is to use analytics, from I have no appetite whatsoever to I absolutely want to use this right now. So you just take a few minutes to think about where you are, what your drive is to use this new buzzword, and let's think about, and we'll reflect on that a little later. So just a couple of minutes to think through that. Okay. So having thought about that, we need to think about what we need to do and what we want to achieve and why are we doing this. So before rushing into using analytics to prove the value of HR, there are some basic rules of the road we need to have. And this is an important point, and it plays exactly to what Rob said earlier, that in a recent survey that Deloitte carried out, only 15% of HR teams were seen as having credibility in talent metrics and analytics. And all I want to change them there, based on what Rob said, is about evidence, being able to bring evidence to the table to justify decisions. So if that's the case, then how do we get that? And how do we get that evidence, or how do we turn the information we have as a business into evidence? And we kind of see that there are 4 steps. Some models have 5, some have 4, but they all basically say the same thing. You start with operational reporting. Some executive wants a piece of information. What's the average age of our critical workforce segment A? Someone pulls an extract from a system, runs around like a headless chicken, pulls a pivot table together in Excel, and then gives them the answer. But it's reactive, it's not responsive, it's not repeatable. But to move from that to something which is a little bit more established, then things feel a little more comfortable and you're able to provide information to the business. You need to hire dedicated people who know what they're talking about. You need to improve the basics like data quality and have a data dictionary. So you know, for example, this is an easy one, potentially, but one organizations often get in a twist about is, what's our definition of FTE? Is it based on a 38-hour week, 35-hour week, 40-hour week? Is it different in one country to another? It's just a simple one there. What do we consider to be total cost for employment? What does it include? What doesn't it include? And then develop some sort of plan to move through that cycle of getting your definitions right, getting your data, getting your people together. 2, be a proactive approach to giving the business the information that they need to make decisions. To understand to be able to consult with the business to understand, okay, so what is it you'd like to know? And how can HR and HR information give you what you need to run your business? And that's the important thing, what you need to run your business, not what you need to run your HR system. So you'll have customizable dashboards. People will be able to get the information they need at the point of need. When they're in that meeting making a decision, they should have the information they need to challenge colleagues, talk about options, etc. But then this is just reporting in the end. It's just going, well, what has happened? Going from the what has happened to why has it happened is the next step. So you want to think about how you implement self-service tools, how you integrate different data together, and how you build the strong technical, statistical, etc. skills and capability to be able to start looking at evidence-based for why things have happened. One of the piece of work I did a couple of years ago with a large oil and gas company, they'd spent multiples of millions of dollars on leadership capability development. And what they wanted to know is, well, what effect has this investment had on our business outcomes? Has our investment of hundreds of millions of dollars in improving the leadership capability of our senior people actually had any impact in how we behave as an organization and on the bottom line? And going back to what Rob said earlier, when we started that piece of work, it made the leadership development team in that organization very, very uncomfortable because we were finally turning the light on about the work that they'd been doing and how successful it had been. So once you've got your advanced reporting right, you can cross the bridge and get into analytics. And advanced analytics is starting to understand why things are happening. And then you can think about, well, if you know why things are happening, you can start to pull on different levers in the organization to think, well, if we move this lever, maybe it's employee engagement, maybe it's pay, maybe it's communication from leadership, whatever it might be, what will the change likely be on the organization? And that's a judgment call. But you want to get more evidence, you want to start thinking about what might happen in the future. And that's predictive analytics. It's advanced statistics based on relevant and valid data. And advanced statistics means understanding who in your organization is going to leave in the next 6 months and why. Who has the most propensity in your organization to commit fraud? Deloitte works with the NHS, and we model their workforce 6 months out, 1.2 million people. You may have seen in the media about 6 months, a year ago, about how they were going to run out of staff for A&E. They were able to predict that into the future and know that they were going to run out of staff, not having the situation being that we have run out of staff and people are dying. That's the value of prediction. You can make interventions before disaster strikes. And once you're there, there is a pot of gold. And we have done a very large survey of organizations looking at what the difference is between organizations who've got this right and organizations who haven't started on this journey. And they have, in general, 30% higher stock returns based on a 3-year average of the S&P 500. But it might just be these are well-run businesses, so well-run businesses in general do better than poorly run businesses. But the point is that well-run businesses value this. And they also have some more tangible things as well. You know, they're 3 times more likely to achieve their cost reduction targets on programs because they can predict what the barriers are going to be. They're more likely to recruit the right people because they know what skills work in their organization, what leadership styles actually fit. And they're more likely to be able to get people into the right roles to deliver what they need to deliver. When you think of all those different evidence points, actually start understanding how making evidence-based decisions based on insight and analysis actually enables the business to perform better. So I've talked to this a little, and it's starting to think through, well, what are the different types of analysis you need to do? And the rule is to know what it is you need to do. You don't need to run ahead to doing some sort of predictive model based on, you know, multivariate logistic regression, when actually all you need to do is to say what's happening. You need to define the question that you'll need to ask and need to solve and think, do I need to reveal what's happening now? Do I need to enhance that analysis to know why it's happening? Do I actually have to build a model to say, actually, I need to know which of my members of my critical workforce segments are likely to leave, commit fraud, et cetera, et cetera. So you need to understand what the sort of question is you need to ask. So on your tables in front of you, there is another A3 sheet. And we see that there are 6 enablers to creating this evidence-based infrastructure in HR. There's your business strategy and culture, your stakeholder engagement, there's your data and your reporting, there's processes and controls, technology and infrastructure, and the capability of your people. And across those 5 things, what I'd like you to do is just to think on your table where you are as an organization from 1, absolutely nascent, to 5, we can hold our heads up high and think that we are absolute market leaders in this. So just take 5 minutes or a couple of minutes just to think that through and think, well, where we are, and that will hopefully give you an idea of, well, what are the things that we might need to focus on in order to help build our organizational capability to be more insight and evidence driven? Okay. So one of those foundations is data. And you've got to know and you've got to love your data. Now, data isn't just, and I want to make this clear, isn't just data sitting in some sort of database system somewhere in SAP or Oracle or something. It's all the data and information you can gather from both externally, internally, and it also includes perceptions, experience, and various other things. But when organizations tend to think about data, they tend to think about that SAP database, that Oracle database they've got sitting there. And they also don't really govern, control, and collect data based on the decisions that the business needs to make. What is the evidence we need to collect? Therefore, if we know what evidence we need to collect, we know what information we need to support that evidence. So you need to start thinking about your data not as an enabler to your transactional systems to hire, fire, recruit, pay people, but actually as a source of potential competitive advantage. So start thinking, well, what are our market pressures? Okay, so our market pressure is that we've got a profitability challenge. Okay, if we've got profitability challenge, what are the data points that we need to collect around that? And then you collect the data. Because often organizations are faced with a business problem, and then they go and scrabble around in their HR system, and they say, actually, we don't actually know how much people cost. So if we don't know how much people cost, we don't know how the impact of our people is on our bottom line. So you need to start thinking about what are the business problems we have, how do we solve them, and what information do we need? But to get the data right, the foundation of business decision, you need to think about different things. How can you govern that data and information to make sure it's accurate, timely, and relevant? How do you ensure security and personal data privacy? That's a big issue. Often when you're doing these analyses, problems with German work councils pop up, various other things. Legal and regulatory requirements around retention and storage of records. Lots of that predictive stuff I talked about briefly earlier requires you actually to have records going back 5 years, 6 years, 10 years. For many of the data sets we hold about people, we can only save them for a certain amount of time after someone leaves an organization, creates a limitation. How can you make sure that the business has access to the information it needs at a relevant time? And how do you enable them to use that data effectively? How can you migrate data between systems? Because earlier we realized that actually we might need to pull data together to answer our strategic business problems. How do you manage keeping that data? How do you store it? Is it in a drawer in files? Is it on a USB stick? Is it in the cloud somewhere? And who owns the data in the organization? Often we're challenged by the fact that finance owns payroll, HR owns talent and performance data, and finance owns profitability. But who has overall responsibility for making sure that the data and information in an organization works for the organization and not the other way around? Accuracy, completeness, that's a sort of mother and apple pie statement. But how do you govern that and make sure that you've got the accuracy you need? And another thing that is a good thing to think about as HR professionals is materiality. How accurate does the data need to be for you to answer the specific problem you have? Often HR get themselves into a tangle over, well, our headcount figures are 0.2 FTE out. Does that scale of materiality or the amount of noise or inaccuracy in the data that you're willing to accept in order to make a business decision relevant? You often see in financial statements of companies that they'll have balancing figures of several £1 million just to make the figures add up. Whereas in HR, we quibble over 0.1 of an FTE. Let's think about what is the accuracy of the data we need to make the business decision that we are going to make. And then once you've defined how accurate you need your data to be, how do you govern the data to achieve that level of accuracy? And then how do we interpret it? How do we turn all of this information, this data, into actionable insights that provide the evidence to make good decisions in business? So then we come to our fourth rule, and that's to think about how your culture will respond to a change in the way that you make decisions as an organization. How do you make sure that you overcome the reticence of leadership to be challenged on the basis of their decisions, going from just gut feel and experience to gut feel, evidence plus experience equals decision, as Rob talked about earlier. How do you make sure you've got the leadership in the right place? Your chief evidence officer or your chief analytics officer, or whatever name you're going to call them, are they strategically placed in the right place in the organization? Do they have a mandate to challenge the decisions of leadership? And then how do you get these rare people, these rare talents who are able to both understand the business problem, are able to collect the evidence and analyze that data to recommend a decision? How do you nurture that talent? How do you develop it? And how do you source it? And you're probably going to need to, if you want to really up the game in terms of evidence in HR, you're probably going to need to think about a structured approach for how you take it. It's not a switch that can be flipped overnight. It requires long-term investment in people, technology, capability, and all those sorts of things. And the bottom line, it's the role of business-facing HR to embed analytic principles, analysis principles, evidence principles into the business, at least when it regards people. And it just reinforces what I've said earlier, another pretty picture, which is you've got to bring it all together to make this work. You've got to make sure you've got the maturity of your data-driven culture or evidence-driven culture. You've got the structures for control and governance in place. You understand what the remit of your evidence-providing team is, and you know what is the business requirement that you're addressing, what is the business need you're addressing, and that should always be your focus. So I'll just pause there for a second and just ask if there are any questions on where we've got to so far. Okay. So the next part of my presentation is, well, how do you demonstrate the value of HR in an organization? How do you measure its effectiveness? How do you stand up and count and measure what you're doing, what interventions work and what don't? And it's difficult. We worked with a large oil and gas major recently to help their HR business partners step up to the challenge of making evidence-based decisions. And we work with them to think through, well, how does our organization deliver value, revenue growth, operating margin, controlling assets, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then what are the levers against which HR can influence these things, various different things. Then what's the value chain for HR? So managing workforce planning, getting recruitment and talent, managing where people are going, coming in, how do you drive employee engagement, et cetera, et cetera. And then what decisions are made around those different aspects. But then what are the KPIs against that? How do you measure that successful? Okay, you've got a leadership development program, but what are the outcomes you want of that? Oh, you want people to feel more open. Does that mean that the call to the employee ethics and reporting line go up or go down? Does that mean that actually you're having better performance management conversations, so actually non-regretted exits go up? What are the KPIs you're looking for and wanting to achieve? How do you govern that? And then what are the information assets? What are the things you've got to help you answer these things, and where do they come from? So is it your learning system? Is it the CVs that you've got hidden away in a drawer in recruitment somewhere? Is it your organization structural information, your reporting relationships? Is it sales data or financial data? And where are these different things coming from, and how do you pull this information together to make your evidence? And then how do you utilize those different sources? So what did they do? They created what they called the Analytics Academy. So they took their business-facing HR through a whole curriculum to help them build the foundations of analysis and insight, and be able to use different sources of information in order to evidence their decisions. And this has been rolled out to their entire business partner operation. This organization, I think, has well over 5,000 business partner-y type people. So this has been a big, big operation. But one of the main outcomes for them has not been some sort of tangible measure in terms of, oh, recruitment's gone up, or retention's gone this, or we're being more profitable. It's actually business partners and HR are seen as more credible by the business. They're having better discussions, and they're being invited to the table to talk about business decisions. We're thinking a lot about where HR is in businesses at the moment. Actually, that's just a big win. HR is becoming a respected business partner and a respected part of the business, rather than just the people who sit in the back room worrying about engagement surveys and who you get to do your recruitment for you. So another bit of work we've done recently is with a major UK charity, and they had the problem of, well, how do we get our business partners to think about our organisation strategy, what our organisation needs to achieve, and then how we build the insight and evidence to support the decisions we need to make in order to deliver the people elements of that strategy. So there are some things, what we wanted to do was to try and help them become what we called strategic thinkers. You may argue about whether this will achieve that, but it certainly helped them think and think through. So strategic thinkers take a broader view. They understand the situation and the context that they're in. So you have your strategy, you have the business now, you have your business in the future, and recognize where their power is to influence those things in order to achieve what the objective is. They understand who their stakeholders are and their customer. So they understand how they need to communicate, talk to, and influence the people around them to achieve that objective. They also know about the limitations of their role and responsibilities and their sphere of influence, be it over policy, action, people, whatever it might be. And then any execution of analytical task or evidence building is done in that context. And there are various different things that you need to have right. So you need to prepare to succeed, you need to gather all the information you need to make sure you've got the data and the intelligence to inform your decision. You need to identify what the decisions and outcomes that need to be taken are. That's not necessarily the decision, it's the decision options that you can take. And then what outcomes you want to achieve, and then you can execute. So you understand the decisions, you understand the outcomes, you pick the best outcome and the best decision, hopefully, and then you execute your strategy. But the bit that they struggled with the most was the data and the intelligence bit. They kind of got okay, we understand about decisions and working out which is the best one, but how do we use this data stuff to understand? And this is a bit of a repeat of what Rob said earlier, but, what is required? What's the data we'll need? What can it tell you bottom up? Do a bit of a sanity check. Is the data that we're gathering valid? Is it timely? Is it relevant? And what skills do we need to analyse this data? And then looking at fact-finding. Did you get all the facts you need? Did you do it effectively? Did you talk to the right people? Did you interview the right people? Did you create a series of hypotheses against which you can test using the data or the information you've collected earlier? Did you break the problem down in the right way? And how confident are you in your analysis, and what assumptions did you make? I think that's another key thing that organisations often don't understand is when you're making a decision, what the assumptions and biases are which will colour the recommendations that you make. So I'll just stop there actually. Has anyone got any questions on that? Rob? No? Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
What is the role of, so you talked very much, almost totally about, or most about internal data.
Mm-hmm.
What's the role of external evidence, say, from academic sources?
So from academic sources, they often help you with your hypotheses building, is where I say you start off with. An academic may say, if you carry out a communication or engagement in this way, or these are the 5 engagement points in an organisation most linked to a profitable outcome, then you need to start thinking, okay, so that's our input, that's our hypotheses. We need to check, actually, that those are the right levers to pull in our organisation. So then you gather the information to test those hypotheses within your organisation to justify the action. And then the external data points as well can be not just journals, reports, articles, but can also be actual data. So one of the most interesting things you might want to think about doing when you get back to your businesses is getting an extract from the Met Office of temperatures and weather over the last few years and correlating that against your sickness absence rates. You might find some interesting things if you do that. Looking at one organisation that I was helping recently was looking at ethics within leadership and whether a particular intervention and program around ethics was working. And one of the things they hadn't thought about was, well, how do you control for local corruption rates? So the way we did that was to take the UN's Global Corruption Index for those countries and use that as a controlling variable. So there are all sorts of different information that you can get, and you shouldn't be hamstrung by what's immediately available to you within your organisation. Does that answer?
Yeah.
Oh.
What do you think are the most innovative things coming over the hill in this space?
So,
particularly to Rob's point, you know, in terms of other evidence sources.
So one mining client had a problem with safety, and they were doing all the best practice things you can think of. They had the right policies, right equipment, right training, all the things that you would expect a responsible employer in a high-risk environment to do. But they were still having serious accidents, and they were still having deaths at work, which was absolutely unacceptable to them, and they weren't willing to tolerate it. So they wanted to take a new approach. So what we did was we pulled together every single bit of information we think might in any way be relevant, from weather, performance management scores, engagement, local economic factors, shift patterns, you name it. We pulled it all together into a great big, well, for want of a better word, hopper. And then we processed that using a technique called self-organizing maps, which is a form of artificial intelligence. And what we were able to do was to segment their population by risk of having an accident. And we identified 14 clusters. Now, those 14 clusters all had different properties around propensities to have accidents. But there was one cluster in particular, which was exclusively male, aged over 50, had declining performance management scores, had the worst accidents, often resulting in serious injury or death, and also were always also the most expensive ones to deal with. Not that that's the most important thing, but was an interesting factor. And they all had their accidents on the final hour on the 7th day of a 7th-day shift. So by that organisation intervening at that point in the shift and making sure that things were followed, that processes were good, because you can imagine you've been working 7 days, you're getting tired, you're getting sloppy, you're really experienced, you don't really care about the company anymore, so why should I hook on? It's an extra 10 minutes, I'm getting off in 5, what does that matter? So that's an example of where something, taking a very broad approach to data, has had a very real outcome for an organisation, not a financial one necessarily, but one that's been better for their people. The other things that I've seen which are really quite cool is another mining organisation who looked at employee retention, and they built a very sophisticated statistical model, which is great, and it tells you who's going to leave and who's got the highest propensity to leave. What it actually does is for the HR business partners looking at this information, it tells them, well, what are the drivers of this person's propensity to leave? Is it the amount of holiday they've taken, the amount of hours they're working, their manager's performance rating score? So it gives HR the ability to intervene and take action on specific points rather than just knowing that, oh, there's this group of people over here, they're more likely to leave. So where it's most exciting for me is where it actually results in the business being able to take relevant action that leads to a better outcome. So it's just a couple of examples.
Does someone have a question?
Thanks, Andy Spence. I had just a question around the training. So a few years ago, the last decade, there was maybe a fad or a trend for Six Sigma lean training for business partners, for example. And my observation was after training, after Six Sigma, the business partners would be looking for data still, rather than solving business problems. It's my personal observation. How successful was your training around improving strategic expertise you mentioned?
So what we're trying to do is to start from the business problem rather than the technique or the you need to use analytics to solve your business problem, or you need to use evidence. Start with the business problem and get them to work their way backwards. So I think along with Lean Six Sigma, and I think Rob said, is that the idea is that was the way to solve all of business's problems, whereas we're thinking actually, well, what is the problem? What is the evidence you need to solve that problem? How do you get that evidence? So that it's kind of switching it the other way around.
I was wondering, what's the average investment a company needs to make to get from level 1 to level 5? and I know it might be a bit of a difficult question. So let's say, take for instance a large mining company you were referring to.
Okay. It's best to see it as a journey. Going from level 1 to level 2 actually is the hardest step, I think, really, honestly, and requires an awful lot of investment, potentially millions, in order to get people to get the data in the right place, so people to systemize things. You've got to have a team in place who are able to do that. But then when you go from step 2 to 3, it becomes more about the capability build of the people, and that's potentially a longer term journey. That's about hiring the right people. And that doesn't necessarily have to be very expensive. And then going from level 3 to level 4 is just a further development of that. So it's the getting your feet off the ground is the hardest and most expensive step. And then you've got all the other things you need to think about it, which may not be directly related, like, well, okay, so we've got to do the capability development of the wider group of people, the wider business partners. That's expensive. They need to take time out of their business. We need to make them think differently. So there's a whole change journey wrapped around that as well.
Okay, just from your experience, my limited experience of trying to do this sort of thing with organisations is that people get very impatient and there's this incredible bias towards action. And people think doing stuff is helpful, whereas I think doing stuff is often really unhelpful. Thinking is actually pretty helpful. Doing stuff can be disastrous. And as Einstein actually sort of, I think, said, that if you had 1 hour to save the world, he'd spend 59 minutes analysing the problem and understanding it and 1 minute taking action. How do you, I guess you've come across that kind of resistance. How do you convince people it's worth slowing down, stopping, thinking, getting the information?
Completely agree with you. I was in China last week doing a training course on this as well, and they have a great saying, which is if you're going to chop down a tree in a day, spend from morning till sunset sharpening your axe and chop the tree down at night. So the answer is you start with pilots or a specific business problem which is containable, and you use that business problem to inform what data you need, how you set these things up, what capabilities you need, and you focus a project on solving that particular business problem at the point of need, and then you use that as a template to solve other business problems. Some bits of the template will be relevant, some won't, but you make the business think about the specific problem they're trying to solve. That's how I would tackle that problem.
Back to Steve.
So Faye knows me. I'm going to throw the cat amongst the pigeons now. This is a question to both of you, to Rob and to yourself. Between the two of you, do you think you can come up with the holy grail of how to get there fast? Because most companies, and certainly the ones I deal with, they want an answer that gives them the monetized thing today, not in a long time. So, and I'm still a little bit confused as to whether it's evidence-based or facts-based, and is there a difference? And where do the two join? So, big question, but I want to know whether there is a quicker way to get to utopia, yeah, based on both your theories.
My answer would be there is no quick fix. My answer would be that there is a distinct difference between facts and evidence. Facts are just pieces of information that are disconnected and laid out in front of you. Evidence is how you join those facts together in order to tell the story, which leads to a decision. And it's the ability to take those facts, link them together, and then make a decision, which is the limiting factor for most organizations, I think, and takes the longest time to build. Where you can add immediate value is where you take a specific business problem and tackle it systematically, no, I can't speak. You know what I mean. Thank you. To solve that problem using an evidence-based or analytics-based approach. So that's my weaseling way out of that answer, but I don't know if Rob's got a perspective.
It's a really great question. I think doing things fast or too fast is the problem this is designed to help fix. So, in fact, there's a paradox, and maybe that's why you asked the question, in saying, doing this fast, do you want your surgeon to learn how to heart surgery really, really quickly? Or do you want them to learn how to do it really well? I mean, that's the question. And I think you can do superficially things that look fast, but it takes a long time. And I think also behind your question, as some organizations get more obsessed with certain performance indicators that are ever and ever and ever shorter term, everybody knows they're going to get their arse kicked if they don't meet those short-term targets. Now, again, that runs completely counter to this because people say, great stuff or great data, but I've got to get this done by next month or the next quarter. I haven't got time for this. And that is one of the things I think really does get in the way. Yeah. So I don't think there's a quick fix, but I also do agree. If you can illustrate using a very tangible, focused, containable example, the benefits of this, people start to get it and they get enthusiastic. So the best way of doing it fast, I think, is to probably show an example and give people the capabilities. Because again, I think as Robert pointed out as well, people they feel very uncertain about how to do this stuff and makes them quite anxious and quite worried. And that's one of the things I think that might help you do it a bit faster, is to help deal with that head on.
Cool, thanks. Yeah. So another example is a learning provider we worked with. And they needed information, needed to build a dashboard about how they delivered training to the organization and what their pipeline is, what their cost is. When we started working with them, they had no idea what the profitability was of one of their interventions. They kind of knew which training course they offered was the most profitable, which ones were loss leaders, but they had no idea around a specific intervention. If we hold it in Houston versus Cairo, which one's more profitable? Should we bother hosting it in Houston because it's really expensive if we hosted it in... So they had no idea about that. What we did with them is we worked to pull all that information together to build a dashboard that gave them the information they needed to answer those questions. Again, this is just timely information at the right time, which enables them to make a decision. It's quite simple. But the key thing is that there was no way that those people who, frankly, are learning and development practitioners, not analytics experts, could have taken that from a raw extract from Excel, from a system, run a few pivots and made the decision. What we had to do with them is design a way of presenting that information in a way that enabled them to answer the question. So when it comes to capability, sometimes you have to take people where they are and put an awful lot of effort into presenting information and evidence in a way that people can use. And thinking of that, there's an activity I'd like you to do very quickly, and that's just to jot down on a piece of paper what are the 2 pieces of information that you need and your boss needs to influence the business more effectively. What is the information that you would like to have? And just think through that and what it is. And once you've done that, just think how you'd present that information, that evidence to them. So just reflecting back on what some of you wrote down, if you could raise your hand if that information involves some sort of quantitative information that requires the processing of some sort of numerical information. Okay. How many of you think that it does not require some level of qualitative experience, gut feel information to lay over the top of that in order to provide evidence and insight to the business? That's good. And then thirdly, how many of you thought of a way that you could present that information effectively to get your message across? I know it wasn't a very long period of time, or have an idea about how you might do that. So that's for me, that's the key capability gap. It's quite easy to think about what analysis you need or information you need and what the various elements you need to draw together. But actually thinking about how you turn that into a story that enables decision making is a key capability gap, in my opinion, for HR. I'm just going to skip through this because this is all very nice, but they're just some examples. What I'd like you to think of now, thinking of that bit of information and perhaps more broadly, is think, well, what are the analytical or what are the evidence-based activities that I want to carry out, and plot them against how advanced I think the analytical capabilities need to be in order to deliver that evidence, and then what's the value that will create to the business. So you just have a think about that, and maybe if you've got the inclination, jot it down on a piece of paper. And then once you've done that, if you can just sort of reflect on your appetite to use analytics and your current capability in that area that we touched on at the beginning of this session, and just have a pause for thought about thinking, well, based on the maturity, the enablers that we had earlier, the maturity are, what are the next steps that you might want to take with your organization to start moving yourself forward to create a more evidence-based HR decision making? Hopefully I've left you with some things to think about. Okay, right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert.